Imagine it's late 2028, the kind of year where the news stops feeling like information and starts feeling like a countdown. Headlines scream across your screen. Europe's grain supply is collapsing. Ports are jammed. Rail lines are stalled. A shock ripples through logistics like a crack through glass one fracture. Then a second, then suddenly the whole structure is webbed with failure. In 3 major G7 nations, a coordinated cyber-attack punches through the power grid. Not an outage, a takedown. In the span of hours, the modern world relearns an old truth. Electricity is not a convenience. It's civilization. Panic buying follows because humans are predictable in crisis. Your local supermarket turns into a silent riot. Carts slamming, shelves stripping. Strangers staring at each other like competitors for the last calories on Earth. The shelves don't just empty, they vanish, as if food was never there to begin with. Your phone becomes an IV drip of fear. You doom scroll while your net worth evaporates in real-time markets, spiraling, currencies wobbling, insurance policies suddenly feeling like paper promises. You're anxious, you're hungry, and you're watching the system discover its own fragility. Now imagine you're in Finland, while the rest of the world is collapsing into algorithm-fed panic. You are fine. Not fine like optimistic, fine like prepared. Fine like the crisis is not a surprise, just a scenario Finland has rehearsed in advance. You have months of food security guaranteed by the state, not as charity, but as national design. Under your apartment building is a shelter warm, sealed, filtered built into the architecture of normal life. It isn't a dystopian bunker hidden behind a billionaire's gate. It's under your feet, part of the city's skeleton. On a normal day, it might be used for storage, parking, or a floorball court. On the day the world breaks, it becomes what it was always built to become. And Finland's economy. It isn't collapsing because it was built for this. Built like a machine that assumes failure will happen. Built like a society that looks at catastrophe and says, calmly, okay, execute the plan. Welcome to the only country that treats apocalypse like a logistical inconvenience. This is not a story about happiness, at least not in the way people usually sell Finland. Not the sauna. Not the northern lights. Not the cute rankings. This is a story about survival. Because Finland has done something almost nobody else dares to do in a world obsessed with optimization. It pays for redundancy. It funds the unprofitable parts of security. It builds systems that look inefficient till the day efficiency gets you killed. Most modern economies are built on a single religious belief: just in time. Lean inventories, maximum profit, zero slack. The supply chain as a tightrope, beautiful when the wind is calm, catastrophic when it isn't. One ship stuck in the wrong canal, one war in the wrong corridor. One pandemic that shuts down the wrong factory, and suddenly a civilization of convenience discovers it has no margin. Finland looks at just in time and laughs. Finland runs on a different doctrine, just in case. And that doctrine has a name, an institution, a budget, and a quiet authority that never waits for permission from the news cycle. It starts with something that sounds boring till you understand what it really is. The National Emergency Supply Agency. Not a symbolic office. Not a dusty archive. But the economic equivalent of a doomsday prepper with an unlimited credit card and a legal mandate. While other countries talk about strategic reserves like it means a few barrels of oil, Finland stockpiles like it expects reality to fail. Grain, fuel, medicine. Critical spare parts. Materials that are invisible in peacetime and priceless in crisis. And they don't just hoard them like museum artifacts. They rotate them, maintain them, plan for the replacement cycle. They treat inventory like a living weapon, quietly refreshed, quietly ready. Here's the twist that makes Finland's system feel almost unfair. The Finnish state doesn't carry the entire burden alone. It builds preparedness into the private sector. In Finland, major companies in critical sectors aren't just businesses. They're a part of national defense. If you import medicine, you aren't only chasing profits, you are managing survival capacity. If you distribute fuel, you're not just an executive, you're a quartermaster for the nation. Economists can criticize this all day. And they often do. They'll say it reduces efficiency, it ties up capital, It lowers return on equity. It makes the market slower, heavier, less optimized. They'll point at spreadsheets and say Finland is leaving money on the table. Finland hears that and responds with a question that belongs in every finance lecture but rarely appears in one. Optimized for what? Optimized for profit when the world is stable, or optimized for continuity when stability dies. Because in a world of pandemics, trade blockades, cyber warfare, and weaponized supply chains, efficiency becomes a synonym for brittle. And brittle systems don't bend. They snap. Finland pays an insurance premium every day so that when the global economy flatlines, it can keep the lights on and the people fed. And if that sounds paranoid, good. Because the most dangerous thing a country can be is surprised. Now, that's only the first layer: food and inventory, the material basics of survival. But Finland doesn't stop at warehouses. It embeds survival into architecture, into urban planning, into concrete, into bedrock. Because in most countries, bunkers are private fantasies, rich men preparing to outlast everyone else. In Finland, bunkers are public infrastructure. They are mundane. They are everywhere. And that's when you realize the Finnish system isn't built like a government program. It's built like a civilization that assumes the sirens will one day be real. So the question becomes, how do you build a society where survival is not a luxury product, but a default setting? That answer is underground, literally. In most countries, a bunker is a sign of fear. In Finland, it's just real estate. To understand the scale of what Finland has built, you have to forget the Hollywood image of a concrete box buried in a billionaire's backyard. Stocked with canned beans and conspiracy theories, Finland industrialized civil defense. There are approximately 50,000 civil defense shelters across the country. Let that sink in. With a population of roughly 5.6 million people, Finland has enough designated shelter space for nearly everyone. If the sirens sound, this isn't a lottery. It isn't survival of the richest, it's logistics. And it's not theoretical. By law, any residential or commercial building over a certain size must include a properly engineered civil defense shelter. These aren't decorative, they're reinforced, sealed, equipped with filtration systems capable of handling chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats. But here's where the Finnish mindset shifts from paranoia to brilliance. They don't build 50,000 empty rooms and let them rot. They apply something called the Dulius principle. In Helsinki, you can swim in a pool carved directly into bedrock. You can park in a garage built deep under the city. You can attend a hockey game in a cavern that feels like any other arena. And all of it, every one of those spaces can transform in a matter of days into a functioning civil defense shelter. Water drained, door sealed, air filtration switched, supplies distributed. The cost of survival is embedded in the cost of living. When you buy an apartment in Helsinki, you are paying a quiet, invisible tax not for luxury, but for resilience. When you sip coffee in a downtown cafe, beneath you is a structure capable of protecting human life against catastrophe. This isn't panic construction triggered by breaking news. Finland has been building this infrastructure steadily since the Cold War. Slow, methodical, integrated into the normal rhythm of urban expansion, and they test it. On the first Monday of every month at noon, air raid sirens sound across the country. Not because war is imminent, but because preparedness without rehearsal is fantasy. In most societies, sirens mean panic. In Finland, they mean check your watch. There's something psychologically powerful about normalization. When a society regularly rehearses crisis without hysteria, it removes the shock value. Preparedness becomes boring, and boring is good. But Finland doesn't promise to save you instantly. The state draws a hard line. The 72-hour rule. Every household is expected to survive independently for the first 3 days of a crisis. No electricity, no running water, no internet. This is not optional. It's civic duty. Why? Because in a real emergency, the first 72 hours belong to mobilization, military coordination, infrastructure assessment, strategic response. If the state must spend that window delivering bottled water to unprepared citizens, it loses momentum. In Finland, unpreparedness is not just a personal mistake. It's a drag on national defense. This philosophy reveals something deeper. Finland's model assumes that survival is collective. The state builds the macro shield. Citizens maintain the micro buffer. Neither side carries the whole burden alone. Now, this kind of architecture doesn't emerge in a vacuum. It emerges from history. Finland shares a 1,300-kilometer border with Russia. That geography is not abstract. It shaped the Winter War of 1939 to 1940. When Finland fought against overwhelming odds and survived, though scarred. It shaped the Cold War era, when Finland balanced carefully between East and West, so carefully that Finlandization became a geopolitical term. Preparedness is not theoretical here. It is generational memory. And this brings us to the next layer of Finland's system where economy and military stop being separate worlds. Because in most countries, business leaders run companies and soldiers fight wars. In Finland, that line is blurry. Finland practices something called comprehensive security. The idea is simple but radical. Defending the country is not just the army's job. It is everyone's job. Finland has universal male conscription. A large majority of men complete military service. But here's the key difference from many conscription systems around the world. You don't leave the military. You become a reservist. In a country of 5.6 million, Finland can mobilize a wartime force that is massive relative to its size. This changes the social fabric. Your dentist has trained for field operations. Your IT specialist knows how to operate under blackout conditions. Your CEO understands command structures and contingency protocols. And then Finland goes one step further. Several times a year, the government brings together elite leaders, CEOs, media executives, union heads, politicians, and places them in controlled crisis simulations. For weeks, they rehearse societal collapse scenarios, power grid failure, cyber disruption, pandemic spread, information warfare. They are stripped of corporate hierarchy and forced to collaborate as if the nation is under stress. Why? Trust. In many countries, crisis coordination collapses under ego, bureaucracy, and unfamiliarity. Ministers don't know CEOs personally. Private companies hesitate. Legal questions delay action. In Finland, the Minister of Defense can text the head of the energy grid and say, "Execute contingency plan." And the response is immediate, not because of coercion, but because the relationship already exists. They have trained together, shared hardship, shared scenarios. This reduces what economists rarely measure but what crises always expose: coordination, friction. And yes, conscription has economic costs. It removes young workers from the labor market for months. It impacts short-term productivity. But Finland calculates differently. That lost productivity buys cohesion. In an era where polarization fractures democracies from within, Finland ensures that future executives and factory workers have likely endured the same mud, the same cold, the same discipline. Shared experience creates shared reality. And in crisis, shared reality is more valuable than GDP. But even all of this grain, bunkers, training, cohesion would collapse under one pressure point that has broken modern Europe repeatedly: energy. Because without energy, bunkers are dark. And without energy independence, an economy is a hostage. The real test of Finland's preparedness came not in theory, but in 2022 when Europe discovered what dependency really costs. And Finland did something that looked almost effortless. They unplugged. For decades, Europe operated on a simple equation: buy cheap gas from Russia, use it to power factories, sell high-value goods to the world. Profit. It was elegant. It was efficient. It was fragile. Finland, sharing a 1,300-kilometer border with Russia, was part of that system. Energy flowed across pipelines like oxygen through arteries. It made economic sense until February 2022. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the illusion of neutrality collapsed. Across Europe, leaders panicked. Energy prices exploded. Governments scrambled to find alternative suppliers. Politicians promised emergency packages while citizens braced for winter. Finland did not panic. Finland unplugged. Within months, it stopped importing Russian pipeline gas, electricity, oil, and wood. Not gradually, decisively. How? Because for years quietly, often criticized, they had been building what you could call an energy island. Meet Olkiluoto 3. For a long time, this nuclear reactor was a national embarrassment. Years behind schedule, billions over budget. A bureaucratic nightmare. In another political culture, it might have been cancelled as a symbol of waste. But infrastructure projects have a strange habit of being judged too early. Old Kyoto 3 reached full production capacity in 2023, most precisely when Europe needed stable electricity more than ever. Today, it supplies roughly a third of Finland's electricity. Add to that aggressive wind power expansion, which surged dramatically in recent years, and a diversified energy mix designed for resilience rather than ideology. While some European countries were dismantling nuclear plants in pursuit of political trends, Finland doubled down on physics. They were not optimizing for popularity. They were optimizing for sovereignty. And they designed their grid accordingly. Finland's grid operator has black start capability, meaning if the entire national grid goes dark, it can restart itself without foreign assistance. That is not a technical detail. That is economic independence. Energy, Finland understands, is not a commodity. It is leverage. If your factories rely on a geopolitical rival's pipeline, your economy is not independent. It is conditional. Finland chose not to live conditionally, but energy alone does not guarantee survival. You can have electricity and still starve. Which brings us north onto soil that, by free market logic, should never have been cultivated. Look at Finland on a map. Its latitude aligns with Alaska and Siberia. Winters stretch long. The growing season is short. The soil is often acidic. From a pure efficiency standpoint, importing food would be cheaper. Brazil can grow soy more efficiently. Spain can grow tomatoes year-round. Global trade is designed to exploit climate advantage. But Finland does not prioritize cheapest. It prioritizes certain. Finland produces roughly 80% of its food domestically. Dairy production is nearly self-sufficient. Meat production is high. Grain output is strategically maintained. Oats have become almost symbolic of national resilience. And for what they cannot grow year-round, they stockpile. Remember the National Emergency Supply Agency? Strategic grain reserves aren't theoretical numbers in a report. They are physical stockpiles capable of feeding the population for months if imports stop. During the 2022 to 2023 grain crisis in Europe, when Ukrainian exports were disrupted and global markets tightened, Finland quietly replenished reserves. No drama, no press conferences. Just inventory management. The state subsidizes agriculture heavily not as welfare, but as infrastructure. Every functioning farm is viewed as a distributed logistics node. If a farm collapses under market pressure, Finland doesn't celebrate efficiency. It sees vulnerability. They even focus on energy independence within farming, encouraging use of biomass. Wood chips waste heat from industry. It's coupling calories from volatile global gas prices. A Finnish tomato may cost more than a Spanish one. But you're not paying for flavor. You're paying for February. You're paying for certainty. And this is the pattern emerging again and again in Finland's model. They accept short-term economic inefficiency to buy long-term strategic autonomy. Now, inefficiency in one sector might be tolerable. But what about the digital world? Because if the next crisis doesn't arrive as tanks or blockades but as code, Finland saw that coming too. Cyber warfare is not a subplot in Finland. It is doctrine. Where other nations treat cybersecurity as an IT budget line, Finland treats it as a military dimension. Young coders are integrated into defense programs. Cyber conscription exists. Talented programmers don't just build startups, they simulate attacks on the grid, on banking systems, on infrastructure. The idea is brutally simple. If the internet is the nervous system of the modern economy, then defending it is as essential as defending borders. Finland's telecom ecosystem reflects this thinking. Regulatory tools allow authorities to exclude higher-risk vendors from critical infrastructure. Technological sovereignty is not just patriotic branding, it's strategic insurance. Data centers are built into granite bedrock, not only for cooling efficiency, but for physical protection. In Finland, your cloud is literally in stone. And this extends to societal resilience against information warfare. Because modern destabilization doesn't begin with missiles, it begins with memes. Finland invests heavily in media literacy education. Critical thinking is embedded into school curricula early. Students learn to question sources, recognize manipulation, analyze digital content, not to tell them what to think, but to teach them how. Quaz, a society that panics at every viral rumor is a society already destabilized. The most expensive bunker in the world is useless if your population collapses into distrust and chaos from a fabricated narrative, which leads to the most invisible asset Finland possesses. It's not grain, it's not nuclear power. It's not bunkers carved into rock, it's trust. And trust, economically speaking, is a currency. High trust reduces transaction costs. It reduces the need for excessive oversight. It allows the state to coordinate quickly with private actors. It prevents panic from turning into looting. In many countries, prepping is an act of distrust. People build bunkers because they assume the state will fail. In Finland, preparedness is collective. Citizens trust that the state has a plan. The state trusts that citizens will cooperate. Businesses trust that coordination will not be politicized in crisis. This is why Finland's model is difficult to replicate. You can purchase infrastructure. You cannot purchase cohesion. You can import fighter jets. You cannot import social capital. And here is where the modern comparison becomes uncomfortable. Because the global economy of the past 40 years has worshipped optimization, lean supply chains, minimum inventory, maximum profit extraction, outsource everything, assume stability. Finland looked at that trend, and quietly refused to follow it completely. Now, as supply chains fracture and geopolitical blocks harden, the world is rediscovering something Finland never forgot. Efficiency without redundancy is fragility. But preparedness is not free. It requires political discipline. It requires cultural buy-in. It requires constant maintenance. It requires accepting lower short-term returns. So the final question is this: why would an entire country willingly choose to be less efficient for decades? What psychological and historical forces convinced Finland to pay that insurance premium every single day? That answer lies not in spreadsheets, but in memory, and in a very cold war fought in the snow. If you want to understand why Finland behaves the way it does, you don't start in 2028. You start in 1939. The Winter War, when the Soviet Union invaded Finland with overwhelming force. Most of the world assumed the country would collapse within weeks. Finland had fewer soldiers, fewer tanks, fewer aircraft. On paper, it was outmatched. But Finland did not collapse. It adapted. It decentralized. It mobilized civilians. It used terrain and winter to its advantage. It fought not as a large empire but as a cohesive organism. Finland lost territory in that war. But it did not lose sovereignty. That distinction matters. The Winter War burned a lesson into the Finnish national psyche. Geography does not forgive weakness. Survival requires preparation before the crisis begins. And unlike many countries that slowly forget their hardest lessons during decades of peace, Finland institutionalized memory. Civil defense was not dismantled as paranoia after the Cold War. It was modernized, integrated, maintained. The sirens kept sounding every month. The bunkers stayed functional. The grain reserves stayed full. And while other nations grew comfortable in a world defined by globalized supply chains and post-Cold War optimism, Finland never fully believed the world had become safe. It had become interdependent. And interdependence is not the same thing as security. Fast forward to 2020. A pandemic sweeps across the globe. Suddenly, just in time becomes just too late. Countries scramble for masks, for ventilators, for vaccines. Borders close. Export bans multiply. Even wealthy states discover they cannot source basic protective equipment. Finland does not emerge untouched, but it emerges buffered. Medical reserves exist. Stockpiles rotate. Coordination mechanisms activate. The pandemic didn't create Finland's preparedness. It validated it. And then 2022 arrives. Russia invades Ukraine. Energy dependency across Europe is exposed like a cracked foundation. Germany, long reliant on Russian gas, faces hard trade-offs. Industrial output trembles. Political debates explode. Citizens brace for shortages. Finland transitions. It pivots energy supply, accelerates diversification, and finalizes long-delayed infrastructure projects. And then something else happens. Finland joins NATO, a historic decision that reshapes its geopolitical posture. This was not emotional, it was strategic. Finland calculated that neutrality without credible deterrence is vulnerability, and credible deterrence requires alignment. The shift was swift but not chaotic, because the infrastructure of preparedness already existed. Here is the modern lesson. Preparedness gives you optionality. When the world shifts suddenly, a prepared country can pivot. An unprepared one must improvise. Improvisation under stress is expensive. Preparedness under stress is leverage. But perhaps the most underappreciated dimension of Finland's model is not physical or military. It's psychological. In the age of social media, destabilization no longer requires tanks. It requires narratives. Disinformation campaigns can fracture societies faster than blockades. Viral misinformation can incite panic buying, distrust in elections, vaccine refusal, social unrest. Finland anticipated this battlefield. It invested heavily in media literacy. Education systems teach students to identify manipulation techniques, verify sources, question viral claims. The goal is not censorship. The goal is cognitive resilience. You can build bunkers against missiles, but what protects a society from misinformation? Finland's answer is simple. Teach skepticism early. Because if citizens can think critically, propaganda loses efficiency. And this is where Finland's system becomes almost unsettling in its coherence. Grain stockpiles protect the body. Energy independence protects the economy. Bunkers protect the population. Cyber defense protects infrastructure. Media literacy protects the mind. And trust ties everything together. Trust in institutions. Trust in neighbors. Trust that the siren test is routine, not panic. Trust lowers transaction costs. Trust reduces hoarding behavior. Trust allows coordination without coercion. High-trust societies can mobilize quickly because they don't waste time fighting internally. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Trust is slow to build and easy to destroy. Finland's model works because the population largely believes in it. Citizens comply with preparedness guidelines. Businesses participate in supply security systems. Military service is viewed not as oppression, but as shared responsibility. You cannot import that cultural foundation. You cannot buy it with GDP. You cannot legislate it overnight. And this is why many nations admire Finland's preparedness, but struggle to replicate it. Because the real asset is invisible, and invisible assets don't show up on balance sheets. Which brings us to the final question. Is Finland's model sustainable in a world where crises are no longer occasional shocks, but overlapping waves? Climate disruption, cyber escalation, great power rivalry, economic fragmentation. Preparedness used to be insurance against rare events. Now it may be the baseline condition of modern life. So what is the cost of living in permanent readiness? And is that cost worth paying? To answer that, we have to confront the uncomfortable trade-off at the heart of Finland's system. Efficiency versus resilience. Optimization versus redundancy. Profit versus continuity. And that tension defines not just Finland's future, but the future of every advanced economy. Because if the 20th century was about growth, the 21st may be about survival. So why does Finland have the world's most prepared economy? It isn't just the 50,000 shelters carved into granite. It isn't just the grain reserves measured in months. It isn't just the nuclear reactor that came online at the exact right geopolitical moment. Those are tools. The real answer is philosophical. Finland understands something the global economy forgot during its 40-year obsession with optimization. Efficiency is fragile. For decades, globalization was treated like gravity unstoppable, permanent, benevolent. Supply chains were stretched across continents in the name of cost reduction. Warehouses were emptied. Redundancy was eliminated. Everything unnecessary was cut. It worked beautifully, till it didn't. The Suez Canal blockage in 2021 showed how one ship could disrupt billions in trade. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed how thin medical supply chains truly were. The invasion of Ukraine revealed how dependent entire regions had become on politically unstable energy sources. Every crisis whispered the same message: we optimized for the best-case scenario. We forgot to prepare for the worst. Finland never bought into the fantasy that stability is permanent. Geography doesn't allow that illusion. A small country with a long border against a powerful neighbor cannot afford to assume good intentions. It cannot gamble its survival on global goodwill. So Finland made a choice quietly over decades. It chose to be slightly less efficient. It chose to pay the insurance premium every single day. It chose redundancy. And redundancy in peacetime looks like waste. Maintaining grain reserves ties up capital. Requiring shelters increases construction costs. Keeping standby power plants reduces return on investment. Conscription removes young people from the workforce. Media literacy programs require curriculum time and funding. On paper, these are inefficiencies. But here is the twist. In a volatile world, inefficiency becomes an asset. Finland reframed preparedness from cost to capital. Resilience is not a sunk expense. It is strategic equity. And that's why Finland consistently ranks among the happiest countries in the world, not despite its paranoia, but perhaps because of it. There's a quiet psychological relief in knowing that when the lights flicker, there is a plan. That when the supermarket shelves thin out, there are reserves. That when misinformation floods social media, the population has the tools to question it. Preparedness reduces existential anxiety. And in a world increasingly defined by uncertainty, reduced anxiety is a form of wealth. But there is a final, sobering reality. Preparedness cannot eliminate risk. It can only buy time. Finland's bunkers cannot stop climate change. Its grain reserves cannot fix global trade collapse permanently. Its cyber defenses cannot guarantee immunity from digital warfare forever. Preparedness is not invincibility. It is survivability. And survivability creates opportunity. When less prepared economies are scrambling to respond to shocks, Finland can stabilize faster, recover faster, pivot faster. Preparedness gives optionality, and optionality is power. But here is the deeper lesson, one that extends beyond Finland. The global economy is entering an era where resilience may matter more than growth. The 20th century rewarded expansion. The early 21st century rewarded optimization. The mid-21st century may reward those who can endure. Countries that build redundancy into their system's energy independence. Food security, cyber resilience, social cohesion may sacrifice marginal GDP growth. But they gain strategic durability. Finland has internalized that trade-off. It did not wait for collapse to learn. It learned from history. From the Winter War. From Cold War proximity. From geography, it converted historical trauma into institutional design. That is why copying Finland is so difficult. You can purchase F-35 jets. You can dig bunkers. You can legislate stockpiles, but you cannot instantly manufacture trust. Trust between government and citizens. Trust between public and private sectors. Trust that preparedness is collective, not adversarial. In many societies, prepping is a sign of distrust, people preparing against their neighbors. In Finland, preparedness is communal. They prep with their neighbors, and that difference changes everything. Because when crisis hits, societies don't just fight external threats, they fight internal panic. If your citizens trust each other, they don't loot. They trust institutions, they comply. If they trust information systems, they don't amplify chaos. Finland's most powerful defense system isn't underground. It's social. And here is the final irony. The country that prepares most intensely for disaster is also one of the happiest on earth. Maybe because preparedness reduces fear. Maybe because resilience creates calm. Or maybe because when you know that collapse has been planned for, you're free to enjoy the present. The lesson here isn't that every country should immediately build 50,000 bunkers. The lesson is subtler. We need to stop measuring national strength purely by efficiency and growth rates. We need to start measuring resilience. Because the most valuable commodity of the coming decades may not be oil, data, or rare earth minerals. It may be continuity. And right now, Finland has invested heavily in that asset. Not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently. When the next global shock arrives, and it will, many nations will scramble to improvise. Finland will open warehouse number 4. And that quiet difference may define the winners of the 21st century.